In a few seconds, we are gonna go live. So I think we are live now, right? All right.
Yes,
It's working? Okay. Very good. So good afternoon to all of our dear colleagues from Círculo Lovecraftiano y Horror México. This afternoon, we have a first for all of you. We have previously had guests, but today is the first time that we're gonna do the talk in English. And for this new stage of our cultural diffusion activities, we have the honor of having a guest, a great American author and professor. His name is John Langan, native from New York. Professor Langan, welcome to Mexico, at least virtually.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be the first English language guest. And thank you so much, all of you, for being part of this, and for anybody else who's watching. Thank you for giving me your time tonight.
No, thank you for your time. So we're gonna be talking a little bit about you. Whatever we see on internet, we see that you are from New York. We see that you went to college studying literature, studying arts, and that you have a master in philosophy. So how all this happened? Did you always wanted to be a writer?
Yes, I have a very early memory from, I think, the first year of school, of the teacher saying to us, I'd like you to write a story. And for me, the big attraction was, if I wrote the story, I could draw. I could do a picture to go along with it. And I love to draw. And so I wrote a story about King Kong fighting Godzilla. And I was quite thrilled with this. But until I reached secondary school, my primary ambition was to be a comic book artist. I loved comics, Marvel comics, and this was the 1970s, and so it was the sort of second wave of Marvel comics after Stan Lee in the 1960s, and so that was very important to me. They also led me to some horror. The Conan the Barbarian comic books led me to read the Conan the Barbarian stories. And I'm very sorry to say that I spent most of, I think, my fifth grade math class with the math book up with a Conan book behind it, reading about Conan's adventures. So my apologies, Sister Anne. And then when I went to secondary school, I discovered Stephen King's work. And that was the moment. That was the moment that I knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and which I find fascinating. Not to sound like a narcissist, but I find it fascinating that reading one book, it was King's novel Christine, had just such a total effect on me. And I know that Ramsey Campbell has talked about reading Lovecraft, and Lovecraft having that effect on him, that just this sort of moment that transformed him, that made him say, this is what I have to do. It's as if he was a little compass needle, just sort of, both of us, your little compass needles just kind of wiggling around, and suddenly bang, we found true north. And so that was the direction that I headed in. It took me a while to arrive there. During my 20s, I wrote I wrote a long novel, I wrote some short novels, I wrote some stories, none of which were exactly horror. They dealt with horror emotions, but not necessarily the surface of horror. And I had become very self-conscious about that, and very worried that, horror was not literature. And in part, this was because a professor that I had in my university had told me horror is not literature. And I really loved this professor. I respected her very much. And it wasn't until I met my wife, who was working on her PhD in Jack Kerouac's work, not not so much On the Road, his most famous novel, but a novel of his called Dr. Sachs, which is a very strange, very weird novel that I like very much. And she said to me, we talked about this, and she said to me, you know, Kerouac thought that the material of American popular culture could be a good vehicle for literary expression. And that was what I needed to hear. Um, and after that, I started writing horror and really haven't looked back since that time. And I've been very lucky in that time to have made some very good friends: Laird Barron, Paul Tremblay, Stephen Graham Jones, Livia Llewellyn, Nadia Bolkin. There's a remarkable group of horror writers my own age and younger, who've been at work over the last 15 to 20 years. And so it's helped in a way. It always helps to have colleagues who are doing good work. It helps to keep you as a writer honest. If I read Peter Straub, one of my heroes, and I look at his work and I say, ah, that's so great. I could never do that. You know, I can let myself off the hook. I can say, he's older than I am. He's had so much more experience. But if I read something that Laird did or Paul did, they're both younger than I am, not by much, but by a little bit, and so they keep me honest. So I can I let's I'll let you guys follow up on that. I don't just want to ramble on. What else? What can I? What
Very
more?
good. I think Jose Talamantes has a question for you.
Hello, good afternoon, Professor Langan. I have a question about what you were talking about. It is quite common in Latin America to put some genre books in their own spot, in some hidden corner, way back in some libraries. What do you think when some critics or essayists put horror, fantasy, or science fiction below serious fiction?
I think they're wrong, and I, I think it's complicated by a number of different factors. Um, and I think you know what's funny is in the preparation for our talk tonight, I was reflecting on my own undergraduate years in particular, and I was thinking about how when I was an undergraduate, yes, I had this professor who told me horror fiction is not literature, Stephen King is not literature. At the same time, and most of the English language writers that I was reading, Faulkner, Hemingway. I sometimes am not sure that Faulkner is completely a realist, but you know, close enough. They were certainly in that tradition, but I was also reading just on my own um, writers like Garcia Marquez and Fuentes and Borges, who obviously were realists of a different kind. And my the interesting thing was that those same my same professors who would tell me, oh, you know, Stephen King, forget it. If I said to them, well, what about Fuentes? He's got this novel Aura, and they would say, "Oh yeah, that's a great book, great writer." And I would, so so there seemed to me certain cracks in their logic from the get go. I think that in the United States, in particular, quite often the literary is reserved for the realist or the somewhat realistic. What Salman Rushdie has called mimetic naturalism, and and I think that so there's a confusion of an adjective literary with a kind of fiction, and I think that the literary I think on the one hand about I think it's Calvino who says the literary is that which is never finished saying what it has to say to us. Nabokov says something similar. He says that a literary book is one that we're always rereading, and I think that if you think about the literary in that way, anything can be literature. It doesn't matter. It has to do more with the quality of the writing and the you know, the depth of the character portrayed, say, or I mean, there's so many different ways that a book might continue to speak to us. A book might continue to speak to us, you know, not because its characters are the greatest, but maybe it has a beautiful style, or maybe its character is terrific, even though its style isn't great. The American writer Theodore Dreiser is a terrible writer. He's an atrocious writer. His work is painful to read. And yet his book, An American Tragedy, I think is a great novel. It's not one I ever want to have to read again. But if somebody said to me, do you think this is a great novel? I would have to say, yeah, I think it is. So I think that I think that this also gets, I don't know, I think it gets confused with publishing categories too. I think that um, there's a kind of like cultural value or cultural currency in literature and the literary, and it has to do with certain forms of cultural prestige and um, I think that all of that stuff, especially if you love this stuff, it's very difficult. You know, you love this stuff and you think this is as good as anything anyone else is doing, and to be told no, no, that can go in the back. That can feel a little bit like a slap in the face, but I think at a certain point you just have to be able to say no, you're wrong. I love you, I respect you, but you're wrong.
Professor, Alicia has a question for you.
Yes, good afternoon, Professor. My question is, you were saying that back in the day when you were studying, teachers told you that horror was not literature, but now you are a teacher and now you are in front of people that is studying to be a writer. So what do you say to your students about this kind of literature? I mean, horror. What do you say to them about this style of writing?
Well, I think it depends on the student. I certainly encourage a creative writing student to write as many different kinds of things as they want. And I sometimes think it's very useful. And this was something I actually learned from Stephen Graham Jones, who said that he made his students write, you know, like say he would say to them, you have to write a pirate story today. And they say, a pirate story? And you say, yeah, write a pirate story, because it's not the kind of story necessarily that they're used to writing. And they maybe think they know what a pirate story is, but it's good to have to think in different modes. I tend to think about forms of fiction as like poetic forms. So in the same way that it's good for a poet to have to write a sonnet, even if you don't like sonnets and it's not a very good sonnet, it's a useful exercise. And in the same way, if you may not be a horror writer, but it's useful for you to write a ghost story, to try to understand the mechanics of the form, if you will. So I think, and sometimes people discover, wow, I'm actually very good at doing this thing. That there's more to this than I thought. Um, I I don't want to make the mistake that I think my teachers made of saying, you know, of sort of flipping things upside down and saying, no, horror is the best, you know, because then we just wind up where we were before. For me, it's more about or asking them to consider that there were many different kinds of writing that are equally good in perhaps in different ways. They have different aims, and it's entirely. I think it's entirely fine for anybody to say, I don't like this kind of fiction. It is not for me. But uh, great. But as long as you don't say, therefore you can't read it, you know, or therefore nobody should read it, or therefore it's not very good. The American writer Henry James used to talk about something he called the donné, a French term, the given in a story. And if you're going to read a science fiction story and there are spaceships in it and such, you have to be able to accept them as a reader. And if you can't, that's fine, but that's your problem, not the story's problem. And so I think that you have to be able to give to the story what the story is asking of you, asking you to give it. And if you can't do that, again, no problem. I think it's just I think it's just best to say, okay, that's not for me, but there's no, not to attach any value judgment to that. I think if that makes sense.
We're gonna go with Ernesto in just one moment because I know Ernesto and I know this has something to do with what you're gonna talk with Professor Langan, Neto. There's people in the Facebook Live. They are saying a couple of comments. Maria Gabriela from Guatemala. She says what you were saying is exactly the same in there. We are not asked to read certain type of literature to get a literature degree. In Guatemala, I guess it's the same here in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. Edith, she says she wants to know, and that's why I wanted to say this question before Ernesto, because probably the topic is going to go the same way. She wants to know if you have read Latin American literature. You were talking about this at the beginning, Garcia Marquez, Juan Rulfo, Saramago. What do you think about them?
I love them. I think for a long time, um, and I felt more, I felt more excited by reading Love in the Time of Cholera than I did many of the other things I was reading in English at the same time. And in more recent years, I think it was in part it was Paul Tremblay who really turned me on to Roberto Bolaño's work. And I still haven't read 2666. I'm still, but his stories and his shorter things. And there's an Argentinian writer, Mariana Enriquez, whom I've read in translation. She had a collection of stories. The translated title was "Things We Lost in the Fire," that was translated, and we're sort of. I mean, we're Facebook friends. We don't really. I would love to do one of these with her, because she seems like this utterly fascinating writer, and um, I um, I know that she wrote a great big novel this past, or published a great big novel this past year, which is being translated into English, which I'm very excited about. And if that translator is listening, I would like to encourage you to please finish this translation quickly because I need to read this book. But I know that Mariana Enriquez has a collection, a new collection of translated stories due out, I think in early 2021. So yeah, I find that throughout, I wouldn't say that I've read deeply in the literature of any one country. So I've read Fuentes, I've read Octavio Paz, but I've read Neruda. But so I would say that I have a sort of a surface acquaintance with a number of different writers. Borges has been very, very important to me as I've gotten older. I return to him, but at the same time, Garcia Marquez and Fuentes, for that matter. I love the fact that Fuentes' last published novel is a Dracula story. I just that appeals to me to no end, and so yeah, I find there's a way in which I felt I think, and I feel very self-conscious talking about this because I feel, this is absolutely not something I really feel I know anything about. This is something I approach as a fan. Um, I think what I liked in writers like Fuentes, like Garcia Marquez, not so much Borges in this regard, but Fuentes and Garcia Marquez, I felt took there was a certain kind of Faulknerian quality. They took some of Faulkner's concern with the past and with um, family and heredity, and brought that together with this kind of surrealism that I found very, very congenial. And and I at some point, and this is when I was maybe about 19 or 20 years old, one of the local television stations had an hour-long documentary on about Fuentes, and I just stumbled onto it, and I was just utterly fascinated by it. I think I might have read him before this, I'm not sure, but if I hadn't, it certainly made me think, wow, I have to read this guy. I have to check this guy out because John Updike wasn't doing things that interested me at that time. I've become a little more interested in him now that I'm older, but at the time, the portrait of middle American life just I wasn't particularly interested in it. But the things the things that say Garcia Marquez was doing, where he was moving every novel with something different. Um, that was very exciting to me.
Thank you, Professor Ernesto Moreno.
Hi, John. That was unfair because that was my question. I was gonna ask you about the Latin American literature, but anyways, so now I'm gonna have to ask you two questions.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm very curious about what you like. I would like to know if you have a favorite horror movie or many, and which are. And the other question would be about literature. I want to ask you, you know, you talk on some interviews about your influence, like Robert E. Howard, like Lovecraft, like Dickens, you know, James, but you have a new influences. I mean, this is the question. What are you reading right now
Hmm.
in this moment, and are you liking it? That would be the two questions.
Sure. I have not seen as many horror movies as most of my friends, because I am a wimp. I'm very afraid of horror movies. And when my wife and I first got together, and we would talk, and she said, "Oh, you know, surely you've seen The Exorcist or The Shining." I would say, "No, I haven't." She thought that was a disgrace. So she, you know, sat down with me and she was like, "All right, I'll hold your hand. We're going to watch The Exorcist. We're going to watch The Shining, and so on." And I'm a little bit better now than I used to be. Um, I There are a lot of there are actually a lot of horror movies that I really like. The original Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's film. Um, I love that movie, and I love to show that movie to my students because first off, it's in black and white, and they think, "Oh my God, black and white? How? What? Come on!" And then the beginning is so amateurish, you know. It's so it's almost painful to watch. But by the end of that movie, there's you can hear a pin drop in the classroom because it's such a gripping and such a compelling film. Um, I also, and this will sound odd considering I said I'm a wimp, but I love the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I avoided for a long time because of that title, because of that lurid title. And I thought, you know, I don't need to see this. This is just going to be gore. And it is. I mean, it certainly is a horrifying, physically horrifying film, but it's such a bizarre portrait of the American family, of this family of psychopaths living together, and they all love each other in this very, very twisted and disturbing way. And I love that. I love the way that the film goes to that particular place. Um, I feel like I would be remiss. I feel like most writers of my generation, I was strongly influenced by John Carpenter's films, by The Thing in particular. Um, I think David Lynch's movies I find very, very effective. And Lynch is someone, you know, I will watch anything David Lynch does. I find that he unsettles me more than almost any other filmmaker. I know that some of my friends are like, you know, he's really hit or miss for me. A film like Inland Empire, whereas I loved Inland Empire. 3 hours, I was there. I was like, that's fine. It doesn't matter that I have no idea what's going on. Cronenberg's films, Cronenberg's. In fact, I was just talking earlier with Laird about his horror films and saying, you know, I wish I respect the fact that he's making the movies he wants to make, but I do wish he would go back and make another or come forward, as it were, with another horror film. Things that I'm reading right now to jump to that. The last few years, I've discovered the American writer Philip Roth, whom I tended to ignore when I was younger because I associated him with Updike and that crowd. And I don't mean to pick on John Updike. He's a fine writer, but I associated him with a certain school of American realism that I wasn't really interested in. And as I've gotten older, I've become much more interested in him as a writer, as someone who writes, especially his later novels, novels in which his novelist character, Nathan Zuckerman, encounters people who basically tell him their life stories, which is a kind of fiction I'm very sort of approach to fiction, I guess, or structure of fiction I'm very interested in. So I'm also, in terms of people I'm learning from and continuing to learn from now among my contemporaries. Um, I find that the more I reread, say, Laird Barron and Stephen Graham Jones and Glenn Hirschberg too, another excellent writer, and Livia Llewellyn, Nadia Balkin, Michael Sisko, who's Sisko is a contemporary genius who's almost criminally unknown or I mean I want to say underknown but really unknown, and he's relentlessly experimental and just a brilliant writer. So all of them I read and I learn from. Sometimes very deliberately, sometimes I think, I want to do that. They structure the story in a particular way, and I think, that would be interesting to structure a story that way. And other times I just feel a more general sense of, wow, this story that they've constructed or this novel that they've written is so finely put together. Stephen's new novel, The Only Good Indians, is so finely put together. And it is, I feel, it looks back to Straub's ghost story, but it does it in such a different and idiosyncratic and unique and wonderful way that I think, man, I would love to take a crack at something like that at some point.
I'm going to read a couple of comments, and I want to let you know, Professor, that there's people from several parts in Mexico and from Chile and Guatemala. So we are right now being watched by people from all Latin America.
Hello, everybody.
So it's a good. Everybody's happy to have you here. There's somebody. I'm sorry because there's so many comments, but they were saying that you know a lot of literature from Latin America. Probably you know from all over the world as well. And well, we're gonna go with Gabriela first, and then Caro, and then we jump to the fisherman.
Okay.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for today. I was actually a bit doubting if asking my question, but your answer to Ernesto made me want to ask. And you say you are, well, I must say I'm very like a chicken when it comes to horror. There are some things that I can't read. And it's very refreshing to hear that there's also limits, no? Like even for you, like with movies or like that. And I was wondering if there are topics or motives that you avoid because you feel uncomfortable or because they are just out of your, I don't know, like maybe they're too terrifying to you or too disturbing. So I wanted to know like maybe some gore or something that you avoid on your writing.
I would say I almost have to give a sort of a split answer, because on the one hand, I would say that the horror that I grew up reading in the 80s, in particular into the 90s, used to use sexual assault, rape, quite often as a plot device. And that's something I'm not interested in. I think it's I guess I find it distasteful, obviously, and offensive, but it's also that I feel that there's something about the way that for male writers in particular, they'll say, oh, that's the worst thing that could happen to a woman. And I'm not saying that isn't a bad thing that could happen to a woman, but it's there's some way in which it reduces a woman's experience to this, are you going to be violated or not, and I'm just not interested in that. There are many things I have written that afterwards I thought that was really messed up. And I wrote an early story in which a character, a sort of like a 10 or 11-year-old boy, winds up inside a coffin that eats him, basically. And it's somewhat discreetly handled off stage, but I was all pleased with myself at the time. but then afterwards, I thought about it. I thought, wow, what is wrong with you? That is not, that's really kind of messed up. And every now and again that happens, that I'll write something and just in the heat of the moment, I think, yeah, look at that. And I'm thinking about the way the sentences are put together. And then usually after I've sent it out, at some point I'll just be thinking about out walking my dogs and I'll just think, why did you do that? Those poor characters. I really, I hope I never meet any of my characters because they will have some serious questions to ask me and possibly they'll want a little vengeance themselves.
Thank you very much, Professor. Edith says that she thinks it's kind of lazy to write about the rape because she thinks it's overused, an overused subject. We're going with Caro now.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time and be here, John. My question is about your childhood. Like, what horror books or stories do you remember that imprinted you and still inspire you today?
This is a very interesting question to me, actually. Um, my father was a big fan of horror movies. And the family history, the family story is that when my mother was pregnant with me, the night that she realized that she was going into labor, my father was watching a horror movie. And then when she went to the hospital, this was the time in which men still waited in the waiting room. And while he was in the waiting room, there was a horror movie on the TV. And I've always meant to go, I'm sure I could find it online. I'm sure I could find some kind of archive that would tell me what movies those might have been. It would be interesting to know. But my father was always up for these weird British horror movies, like sort of like Hammer movies, but the even like the sort of knockoff Hammer movies. They weren't ever very good from what I could tell, but I have a very vivid memory. My mother hated them, I should add. My mother was just, although my mother had all sorts of weird little ghost stories of her own, but there was one night that my father wanted to watch this production of Frankenstein, and feel I feel that it must have been a stage production or something like that. And I have this vivid memory of him sitting in my parents' room in his chair with the TV on, and the movie had almost a sort of a red tint to it, whatever, and I don't really remember a lot about the movie except that the monster was a sort of a typical, the square-headed monster, and he was wearing sneakers, tennis shoes, for some reason. That's, it is in my memory. And for whatever reason, I found this just utterly terrifying. But my father had said to me, "Oh, you can come in and sit and watch it with me." But I kept leaving the room, but then going back in and leaving the room and going back in. And 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 my memory tells me that my mother was sitting in the kitchen with my younger brother and maybe the older of my younger sisters. I don't think my youngest sister had been born yet, and they were making little men out of popsicle sticks. They were, which just seems too perfect to have actually been the case. But that I've tried to find that movie for years. I have actually made extensive internet searches to try to figure out what movie it was. And I cannot, I find every now and again, I think, oh, that, and no, and that's not it. So my memory of it is probably so distorted that if I were to actually see the movie, I wouldn't recognize it. But when I was going through my Conan the Barbarian phase and I was sitting in math class reading the stories, again, I have a vivid memory of reading a story called Rogues in the House, where Conan is fighting Thak, the man-ape, a sort of a Sasquatchy kind of thing. And I can remember, I still remember how vivid that was to me, even though my teacher was just a little bit, but I was a good kid. So, either she knew I was doing it or and didn't care, or she just was like looking at the bad kids in the back of the classroom. That should be a secret for any students out there. Always sit in the front of the classroom. You can get away with more. Um, and so the memories that I have from my childhood are kind of strange in a way. There was an American show called The $6 Million Man, about Steve Austin, Lee Majors. He has a bionic arm and legs. And there was an episode where he fights a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, and I was terrified by that. I found that just utterly frightening. Um, there was a time I was home sick from school, and my mother let me watch TV, and there was a movie about these guys who were mining uranium or something like that, and they discover a dinosaur egg, um, perfectly preserved, and it pops open, but the uranium turns the dinosaur invisible. Now, this was a triumph of low budget filmmaking. This way, you never had to show the dinosaur. But every now and again, you would hear the dinosaur roaring, and you would see somebody looking around, and then suddenly these slash marks would appear on their face, and the dinosaur would get them. I was utterly terrified. I mean, and there could be an invisible dinosaur outside of my house this very moment. So it's funny, the things that do fill you with that kind of fear when you're a kid. I was raised in a very, very devout Roman Catholic household, and so things, The Exorcist, and all of the movies that came after The Exorcist, the Omen films, and all that sort of stuff. Those were, as I said, I didn't watch them when I was a kid, but I didn't watch them because I was afraid that if I watched them, the devil would know and he would get me. Um, so, um, so yeah, now that I think on it, Freud uses the term overdetermined, right? The reason that we do any one thing there, is that there are many reasons, that there are so many reasons for any action that we take. And I suppose when I think about where I am now as a horror writer, I feel in some ways, yeah, this was overdetermined. There were so many different threads that wound together to make me, what I am today.
Maria Gabriela, she's making a question that actually goes perfect with what you were saying about the memories and all this. She says, haven't you met your characters in your dreams?
Um, Oddly, I haven't. At least I don't think I have. Maybe I've forgotten because it was too frightening. There's all those dreams I had about angry mobs of people chasing me. It's actually my characters who were chasing me. They're, sit down, buddy. We want to have a chat with you. Um, yeah, I mean, I suppose to the extent that my characters are often derived in some way from people that I've known in life, I guess, um, and the next year I hope to have another collection of stories out, which focuses on stories I've written that are drawn on my own autobiography. And so those stories, in that sense, I've absolutely met those characters in my dreams.
We're going to go just with one more question before we jump into the fisherman. Is Octavio Villalpando. He says, I have a question regarding the future of horror literature, speaking about original ideas. Is it still possible to come up with new ideas? Like you were talking about an invisible dinosaur, and it was a long time ago, but
Right, but you could do that, right? I think that's a perennial question. I think for all the genres, for literary fiction too, I suppose. Do we really need another novel about adultery? And yet, yes, because I do think it's possible to come up with original ideas, or ideas that are original enough. If you want to be, you can be reductive. You can find the Alien movie, the original Alien, seems original enough to me. But there are ways in which you can say, well, it's a parasite, and it's that you can sort of boil things down to archetypes. I think it's in his book Danse Macabre. Stephen King talks about horror consisting of maybe 4 or 5 principal archetypes. I think the vampire, the ghost, the bad place, the werewolf, and the thing without a name. I think that those are his 5 archetypes. And so you could say that, well, you know, the alien is kind of a it's kind of a thing without a name. It's kind of this weird thing that can't be identified, but it also lives inside you. So it's kind of like a vampire. This, you know, so you can always, I think it's always possible in the same way that you can take any plot of any narrative and you can boil it down to some type of, you know, some type of archetypal plot movement. So I think that where originality comes in is in how you as a writer treat the particular monster or the combination of the the horror element, let's call it. You know, I would say the monster, the characters, the setting, the emotion, the language, the way in which the narrative is put together. So I'm quite fond in a lot of ways of those of, you know, as I was saying earlier, of those traditional monsters, because they come bearing with them a certain kind of plot structure that you can play with as a writer. I was talking to I think it was I was talking to my younger son the other night. We were talking about zombie narratives, and zombie narratives now, unlike Night of the Living Dead, zombie narratives now are very often about separated families. There's a separated family, and you have those family members have to be reunited, and I think that may come from Brian Keene's novel, The Rising, which I think might have been the first novel to explore, to use that plot device. But that's very much become the thing now to do when you write a zombie narrative. So, you know, one thought would be that simply not using that plot would do something original. So saying, no, I'm not going to do separated families. I'm not going to do the journey. So many zombie narratives are journeys. I'm not going to do those. I'm going to find something else to do, whatever that might be. I'm going to write about a zombie that just stays in one place, and you know, and I'm not like, I'm thinking about that and I'm thinking, man, how would you do that? But that's the challenge. That would be the originality, would be figuring out how would you make that work. Or I'm not going to do the zombie as you know, the zombie hordes, just the masses. It's going to be one zombie, and we're going to see what happens from there. Maybe he still needs to eat people, or she still needs to eat people. So I think that I think originality is always possible, even if all of us tried to write the same story. What we thought was going, if we agreed we're going to write a zombie story and all these different things are going to happen, we would still produce very different works, because our individual sensibilities would cause us to emphasize different things, and we would wind up potentially with 9 very, very different stories.
Exactly. So now I wanted to jump to The Fisherman. Yesterday we had a long we were analyzing several parts of the books and separating all together. Honestly, it never comes to a full understanding when we do our reading circle. Obviously, the opinions clash sometimes. Sometimes some people like it, not like it. Yours was very, very well liked. There were a couple of people who were like, no, I don't know. I didn't buy the characters. I don't believe in these characters in particular, or at least that they were acting the certain way. Was one of the comments from a good friend. But in general, everybody liked the book. In let's say that we separated in three parts, right? Like the first, the whole wives tragedies and stuff, then the Lotus story, and the final fighting with the Leviathan, with the monster and stuff. So I don't know, guys. Do you feel like asking something about this? I'm gonna ask you. Maybe I go first. Okay, Ernesto, you go first.
My question is about one of the fundamental ideas of the novel. It's about losing people you love. It's about grief. It's about pain. And I wanted to ask you, what is your personal idea? Because we were talking about it yesterday. we were until 3 a.m. talking about it. So what is your personal idea about death? And do you believe what one of your characters says in the novel? And I quote, it says, what is lost is lost. What is your idea of the afterlife?
Well, as I said, I was raised Catholic, and I don't think I'll ever get away from that. No matter how how far I think I've traveled. So I hope that there's something else. And I also hope it's good. I mean, there could be something else because lately I've been teaching the Odyssey to my students, and that afterlife is not so great. You just sort of hang around as a ghost, waiting to drink blood so you can talk. So I hope it's not like that. I hope it's better than that. But I don't know, and I think and in my more pessimistic moments, I think nope, this is just this is it. And yeah, I do find that. I do find that frightening. I recognize, how would I put this? I recognize that if there's nothing, then when you die, you won't know it. You just won't be here. But somehow the thought of knowing that is I still find really frightening. And I guess because I can imagine slipping into not existing. Like that transition strikes me as very, very frightening. And the thought that the people that I've lost in my own life may be just lost to me is in and of itself is sad, and it is frightening. I think in the case of the novel, I was thinking more about the idea that we do have to, I think, accept loss. Even if we believe that we are going to see our loved dead in the next life, or even if we believe that they're still around us in some way, even if we just believe that they live in our memories, that we have to allow them to leave. We have to allow them to recede a certain amount, and that not being able to do that causes all kinds of problems, to put it mildly. And it strikes me that trying to the inability to do that, the inability to let something go, is it is at the root, I think, of a lot of kinds of horror type narratives. In Frankenstein, in Shelley's Frankenstein, not any of the others, you know, she never makes the connection explicit between Victor's loss of his mother and his desire to create life, but it seems pretty clear that it's being hinted that loss so affects him, so disturbs him, that he has to compensate for it in some way. I know that I think it's in Kenneth Branagh's film adaptation, it's made much more explicit. Shelley is actually a lot more subtle about it, but yeah, I think that Stephen King's novel Pet Cemetery, which was another formative influence on me, is all about that. Is all about that inability. If you knew that there was a way to bring back the dead, even if they were a little different, would you be able to say no to that? Would you be able to resist that?
Sorry. We're going with Jose Talamantes.
Thank you. A few moments ago, you were talking about images and how they inspire people to write. While I was reading The Fisherman, in some parts, I actually went to Google Maps in a street view and started looking for the reservoir and around the place and looking at the trees and the highway and everything. How do you approach that kind of writing in this case? Well, in my case, I was reading and looking at the different places. Did you took your notebook and went driving around the 28 and start noting special features or everything? Or it was just an exercise from memory and experience of living around that place?
No, that's a good question. I did make use of the internet to check certain images. But I had driven up and down there enough times that I mean, actually going back my goodness, probably about 25 years, maybe. I had driven around that area enough, and it had made this terrific impression on me because it's such a beautiful place. But I was absolutely haunted by the thought that this valley had been filled in with water, had been flooded, and all these people had been removed from it. And so that that had always exercised a very powerful hold on my imagination. There were stories locally that, and I think I mentioned this in the book, that if you floated out over the reservoir, you could look down and see the buildings still there, which of course was not true. They had to be removed so the water wouldn't be contaminated. But I think that that image, and I'm sure that probably shows up. I'm sure there were stories of flooded towns. I know there are stories of flooded towns all over the place. And I think that that image, it is almost like this image of time or something like that, as if you're looking down through the very medium of time into the past, into the structures of the past. And I think it probably goes back, I think, to reading Stephen King and reading King's stories set in his Maine, his imagined landscapes in Maine, and just imitating him. The first horror stories I wrote when I was very young were also set in Maine because I thought that's where horror stories happen, is in Maine. Um, and it was, I suppose, even in high school when I was writing horror stories, I was already starting to set them locally. And that, when I got into university and I read Faulkner, and I saw the way that Faulkner and King kind of complemented each other in terms of that use of history and that digging into a particular place. And then Lovecraft does it obviously as well. Garcia Marquez does it as well. That became something that it really excited me, I guess. It really made me think that there was just sort of endless material in the place I live, to generate stories.
And it at least from the pictures looks amazing. I have a friend who lives in upstate New York in Saranac Lake. He's a
Yeah, yeah.
teacher too, and I was talking to him about this book, and he said, "Oh, please, no, don't go there because I don't tell me about it because then I'm going to the forest." He likes camping. He likes
Okay, all right,
fishing,
all
so
right.
he was like, "No, don't even tell me. I don't want to know because he's scared. He's a librarian too, but he said I don't like horror." We're going with Morgan.
Hi, and thank you for being with us. My question is more about how do you build a very vivid or realistic character, like with the tragedies in this book? Like, do you have to leave something similar? Do you hear it from someone else, or you have to be more empathetic to portray this pain so vividly? How do you do it?
I think about something Flannery O'Connor said, um, another important writer for me, who said that she thought that a writer had all the experiences he or she needed to have by the time they were 5, at least from an emotional standpoint. And I think that's probably an exaggeration, as are a lot of things that O'Connor said. But I think that there is some truth to it, that it's possible to invent from what you know. It's possible to draw on your own experience. Um, and some of that comes, I think, from digging into your own autobiography, perhaps your own experience of grief, of loss, and in my case. Some of it has to do from, I want to say, extrapolation or imagining, what this would be like, what that would be like. So I think, when I teach creative writing, I give my students an exercise, and it begins in conversation. And the conversation is, what happens when somebody says, "I love you"? And the context for this is Hemingway's nonfiction study of bullfighting, Death in the Afternoon. Um, and Hemingway says that he was at a point in his life where he was trying to learn how things really made him feel, as opposed to how they were supposed to make him feel. And so I use the I love you example, and I say, okay, it's, you know, you're at the McDonald's with your friend, and your friend looks across the table at you and puts down their Big Mac and says, I love you. And if this is a movie, what's going to happen? And they all say, oh, of course, I'm going to say, I love you too. And the music swells and out we go. But I say, okay, but what might actually happen? And then those reactions, you know, I might say no, or I might say, thank you, or I might say stop, or I might get up and just run out of the restaurant, or I might start laughing, or, and any of those reactions, there's, you know, obviously there's a potential for narrative right there, because it's, we've turned from what we expected, which is I love you, the call and response. But what happens when you don't get when you don't get that response, when you get something that's more sort of idiosyncratic? And so I think about that as a way to say, ask my students to sort of mind their own experiences, to think not just about the sort of received, if you will, the cliches, um, but of given situations, but to think, for example, many years ago, when my wife and I were I think we were married at this point, but if so, we hadn't been married that long. I woke up in the middle of the night and I looked over at my wife's side of the bed and I saw the outline of a little girl sitting on the edge of the bed. And I was immediately terrified. I was just so frightened. And the only thing I could think to do was to reach out and touch this little girl. And it was my wife's knee. She was sleeping with her leg up and thereby giving me a heart attack. Um, but that is, you know, in a horror movie, I would have gotten out of there. I would have been like, sorry, honey, it's the scary little girl's here. We had a good run, you know, I'll see you later. But instead I had to reach out towards it. And in so doing, discover it was not what I thought. So I think that those are the things that make characters, as opposed to caricatures maybe, or something like that, that you know, sort of cardboard cutouts or something like that, that the character is the one who will act in a way that is in some way idiosyncratic. And it doesn't have to be crazy, you know, it doesn't have to be that the person says I love you and you punch them. It just has to be, you know, they say I love you and you just don't acknowledge them. You keep eating and you say, so, you know, what are you going to do tomorrow, or something like that. So I mean, the funny thing is that question, we could talk about that the whole rest of the night. You know, we could think about all these examples of of the ways that great writers take characters and make them alive for us, make them, you know, make them live for us. And sometimes, again, I think about O'Connor. O'Connor talked about the way that sometimes a character can be a character because of what they don't do or what they can't do. So often we think about characters, we think that what has to happen in a narrative is that the character has to change. And sometimes it's more interesting if they don't change or won't change or can't change. That can lead in very interesting directions too.
Okay, we're gonna jump into a question from a good friend from Puebla, Mexico. He's a literature not aficionado because he's a professional. Actually has a PhD, Dr. Navarro. But I give the mic to Alicia, please.
Yes, this friend of ours is also a fan of you, and he has a question. He's asking, what are your thoughts about adapting your work to a movie or to a TV show? And do you have any proposals?
I would like it to happen, and I would like someone to give me a lot of money for that to happen. There has been some interest. I've had a number of conversations. My film agent, my literary agent, there's a film agent that's attached to my literary agency, and so every now and again, I get an email from the film agent who says, "This filmmaker would like to talk to you about The Fisherman." And I'll say, "Oh, that's great." And I talk to them and they say, "Hi, how are you? There's no way we can adapt The Fisherman." I say, "Why are we having this conversation?" And it's weird. they just sort of want to talk to you, and you know, just I don't honestly understand it exactly. It's as if they want to just know, are you okay? You know, are you an okay person? You know, and so I hope that at some point it will happen. There's been like little bits of interest in little stories here and there and things like that. Um, it's a difficult time right now, obviously because of COVID, for things getting made. Um, the streaming, you know, Netflix and Amazon Prime and that sort of stuff. I think I want to say it was Amazon. No, I think it was Netflix that showed the adaptation of Adam Neville's novel, The Ritual, which I think is a very fine adaptation, although it diverges from the book. I think it does so in a very interesting way. So there are still, it is still possible for films to be made of works that are not Stephen King. No harm to Stephen King, but it is still possible. But it's I have the sense that Hollywood has entered an increasingly, and this is maybe over the last like 10 or 15 years, an increasingly conservative, yeah, I guess conservative mode, by which I mean they're interested in things that are guaranteed to make them money. So when they make an Avengers movie, and I go to see the Avengers movies, but when they make an Avengers movie and they spend $200 million, they know that it's going to get a lot of promotion and it's going to make them a lot of money back. Whereas to spend 40 or $50 million on a movie that maybe it will succeed, maybe it won't, they're not as interested in that. So I feel that they are. My sense is that they are risk averse, as the saying goes. But I hope that that will change. There were still people, you know, there were still people doing good work. There were still, if you have access to the streaming service Shudder, Shudder has been producing a number of wonderful movies. There's a wonderful movie called Host, which is an hour long, and it's about an evil Zoom meeting, which is perhaps a little, but it was made during quarantine, and it is wonderfully frightening. It is. I absolutely recommend it.
Perfect. We hope we can see it. And actually, I wanted to say, like, fortunately, we a lot of people in Mexico got to. In Spain, actually, I think the translation was made in Spain, right, for The Fisherman.
Yeah, yeah.
And not a lot of your colleagues, I say Tremblay, Simon Stranzas, Lair Barron, not a lot of them. Unfortunately, for a lot of people who do not speak English, they don't get translated in Spanish that often, especially older material, because sometimes the editorial houses, they say like, okay, maybe we can translate the upcoming novel, but not the
Not the
older
old stuff.
material. Yeah, so that's a shame. We're
You know,
going.
it goes back and forth. You know, as I was saying with Mariana Enriquez, you know, when I read her collection of stories, I thought these are amazing, and I discovered that she had at least 6 or 7, I think, other collections of stories. And I don't Spanish. I mean, I read French, I read a little bit of German, um, and for some reason, I'm just really terrible when it comes to reading Spanish. So, so yeah, I want some publisher to help me out, and I'm sure that there are many more writers who would enjoy, you know, who I would enjoy reading, and it's someone's going to have to do it. Yeah.
I'm gonna give the microphone to Gabby. Sorry, to Carolina. You have a question on Al?
Yeah, I am Al. I was just curious, is like there was a lot of references to German background, and I was interested in that. And then I was also just sort of curious overall, the like mythology within the fishermen is like, where did that come from, and or like what sort of references did you take to get there? So that was just fascinating to me.
Sure. Yeah, I feel that there's been a tradition in horror literature of locating the scary thing in Africa. or in Asia. It's kind of a colonial kind of thing, right? That it's always, oh, it's the native peoples or whatever. And and I thought it would be interesting to make the monster, from the very center, as it were, of sort of high European culture and that sort of stuff. Victor Laval wrote a novel called The Changeling a couple of years ago, and he does something very similar, where his monster is a troll from Norway, and he was looking for the whitest possible monster, as it were, that he could find. And so that was part of what I wanted to do, was to flip things a little bit and say that because this neck of the woods, that there was a large Native American population, and it would be very easy to say, oh, it was something that happened with the Indians. But I feel that's lazy at this point in time. And so it seemed more interesting to say, no, it's the Germans. And the mythology, in part, this book was influenced by Herman Melville's Moby Dick. It was my, in some ways, writing back, as it were, to some of Moby Dick. So I was thinking about sea monsters and also in that sort of Germanic world, the Midgard serpent, and also my wife, at the time that I was starting to write this part of the book, was reading a series of novels by Rick Riordan to our son. He wrote the Percy Jackson books, and he also wrote a series of books called the Cain Chronicles that were about these two kids who were involved with the ancient Egyptian gods. And I would always find a way to sort of hang around the room when she was reading the books to him, so I could hear the story. And there's a figure in Egyptian mythology called Apophis or Apep, this flint-headed serpent, which struck me as very similar to the Midgard serpent. And so I liked, which in turn struck me as similar to Leviathan from the Book of Job. So I thought that there was an interesting way to tie all of those things together in this kind of archetypal kind of a way.
Now that you're talking about this influences, as we were researching for this, to understand better your book, Morgan came across several images that resemble a lot of the things that you were talking about, and I mean images in art. There's a painter, Michael Hutter. I don't know if you've ever seen his painting, the Taming of the Leviathan.
It doesn't. I might have, but I don't know. Do you have
I wanted to share it, but for some reason, well, we're having a technical. Maybe in a minute. So we can go with Gabby's question.
Yes, I have a question about a particular character and how it develops a little bit in the story. I was very curious and a bit surprised on the way this woman, Helen, when she comes back from death, how her behavior or her presence in this town or this camp, it's very open. Like everybody knows she's dead. Everybody like they can see it, but she's walking around during daylight, and even though there is apprehension and fear from people, there is still this sort of normalization of her being there. And I was wondering where that comes from. Like you say, you have this Catholic background, and here in Mexico, like the vast majority of people is Catholic, so there is like this normalization of death. So I was wondering where does that come from?
It's funny. I never thought about it in relation to my own Catholic background, but yeah, that is there probably is a connection there. I think what I was thinking more about was this is the principal populations that built the reservoir were African Americans who came up from the south and immigrants who came from Germany, from Italy, Hungary, a number of different places. And I thought to myself how in an immigrant you know, the United States has never done particularly well when it comes to its immigrant populace. This is not like this is not, you know, what's happening now on the border is not a new phenomenon. And so part of what I was thinking was that people in this particular situation might not very well feel that they could run to the police and say, please help us, there's a dead woman running around. You know, they might just get you know, clubbed. And so I think that was part of it. And I think it was all, so that was on the one hand. On the other hand, there was also this feeling of like they're seeing something that is just so overwhelming. They just don't know what to do about it. They don't, you know, it's almost as if you see things sometimes that are so mind bending that you just turn away from them. And you just say, well, you know, you can't acknowledge it. You can't let it in either to say I'm horrified or to say I'm happy. Look, she's back. She was my best friend. So that aversion that they have is an index of how powerfully discordant her presence is with their existence.
Let me just try, because we are almost up in time here. I'm gonna share a little moment, the image I was talking about. I don't know if you can see.
Wow. Yeah, I do know that. That's the cover of a book of stories by Matt Carden, who's another fine writer. Yeah, this came after, at least I ran into this after The Fisherman, but yeah, it's a terrific drawing.
I just want to do a couple of more things. One question that two persons asked the same thing. Octavio Villalpando and Hector Muñoz. They want to know basically the same question is, what is your favorite book? Because you were talking about Moby Dick for this book, and Hector says, is there a book that you can say this book changed my entire life?
Oh man. I don't know, you know, like on the one hand, reading Stephen King's novel Christine when I was 14 set me on the path to becoming a horror writer. So in some ways that's the most important book, but it's not. It's a book I reread a few years ago, and I thought, well, you know, it's not bad, but it's not King's best work. And so I don't know that you know. So on the one hand, it's this book that's tremendously important to me. The same thing happened to me when I was beginning university, and I read Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, and I just thought, this is astonishing. This is, you know, it was one of those books that you can remember where you were when you read parts of it. And there have been, you know, Dickens' novel Dombey and Son. Again, same thing. I can remember where I was when I read parts of it. So there have been these crucial works for me at certain points in time. But I don't know in terms of, you know, like, what's the book you would bring with you to a desert island? I don't know what that book would be. I want to say something like, you know, the Decameron or the Canterbury Tales, or, you know, a book that has a lot of stories within it. But I'm not sure if there's a single novel that that I would choose above all others. You know, I sometimes wonder if that hurt my academic career, because some of my friends who were, you know, like my wife is she started off as a Jack Kerouac scholar, and that was, you know, Kerouac was it for her. And I had friends who were Hemingway scholars, and the same thing, you know, those writers were just everything to them. And I could never find a writer, much as I love a lot of writers, I could never find a writer about whom I felt that I could surrender myself in that way, because I think I was always thinking about my own writing. And so that may be why I'm writing fiction as opposed to critical studies of writers. I'm sorry, that's a lame answer, guys.
It is very complicated, but it's amazing. I mean, maybe later you can tell us 3 books that you would recommend us to read. But first off, maybe I let you think about this question. I'm gonna give the microphone to Abraham Martinez, another writer and comic book creator.
Hi, Professor. My question is regarding The Fisherman also. After finishing The Fisherman, after you see your book in your hands published, do you feel that you tamed your Leviathan? Did you catch your Leviathan? I mean, if you are sure that you complete to describe and explore the topics, the ideas, the lost, the sea monster, the world before the creation, before the Genesis, the Black City, are timed, are completely these ideas developed there, or do you feel that there is something missing and maybe we will see The Fisherman later?
What would I, so when I was writing the novel for a long time, I paused in the writing of the novel at the section where the men are basically getting ready to go in the middle of the book when the men are getting ready to go and confront the fishermen. And I didn't really know how to approach that necessarily. And I thought, in fact, one thought I had was that one of them was going to be left behind and you were going to stay with him and you wouldn't see any of the crazy stuff, which I think would have been a horrible idea. And fortunately for me, I got advice from the great Jeffrey Ford, who said, look, when you're writing a novel, especially an early novel, a first novel, second novel, your impulse as a writer is going to be very conservative, to play things very safe. And he said, fight that impulse, just go nuts. And so I decided, okay, I'll do that. I'll go nuts. Um, so that in some ways I feel that made for a better book than the one I thought I might write. What it also did though was to leave me with all sorts of things that I wanted to know more about. And so I've written some stories that have touched on little elements from the fishermen. I have two novels that at some point I'll get to writing, which are one of them one of them tells what happens to the character of Rayner. There's a reference late in his story to him disappearing for a week and then coming back. And so it's about that lost week and what happens. And then there's also in that same section, there's a reference, and this is actually taken from something that did happen when the reservoir was being constructed. A group of men who were pulling up trees. They pulled up a tree and they discovered some type of crystalline formation in its roots. Now, I suspect that this was maybe a maple tree that had been struck by lightning, and that's probably all it was just a big piece of candy. But I thought that was much too good to waste, you know. So that object that appears very briefly in The Fisherman, there's a novel that's connected to that. So I don't have in mind exactly straightforward sequels, but more of a kind of a rhizome or something, you know, something that's sort of branching off in different directions.
Thank you very much, Professor Langan. Well, I guess we are about to, we have taken a little bit more of your time than we expected, but
oh, that's okay.
It's been amazing. Now that you mentioned that, that gem that everybody was fighting for in The Fisherman, like probably was just a piece of crystallized maple that ended up in the ground or something. There's this thing in Stephen King on writing book that he says, if you write something, you explain it. And then there was this issue between Ithalo and his wife when Helen whispers.
What does Helen whisper to her?
Yeah, you didn't tell us. I mean, obviously,
she tells her that she has cancer. She tells her she whispers, you have cancer and you're going.
How can we None of us came up with that last night, right?
That's a relief, actually. You know, but yeah, that's the secret. She knows of her death. She knows that she's going to die.
I need to say, Professor, that I'm ashamed that I didn't that none of us came up with that last night. No, nobody said like.
What did you think? I'm curious. What did you think it was? What were the options you discussed?
I'm gonna tell you my option. I thought it was something to do with infidelity, either that or the loss of a child back in Italy or something like that. Maybe it's something they did together, an abortion. You know, Italians Catholic as us Mexicans, everybody is Catholic. So imagine doing an abortion back in those days. It would have been literally you're going straight to hell.
Yeah.
So it's probably, I thought of that. I don't know if the rest of you guys, if some of you want to give it Talamantes.
I thought they ran away from Italy from some reason, some evil reason.
Okay, yeah.
They did, and they have to run away together to America. And it was like their big secret. And if it goes out, everyone is going to like come look for them and everything.
Wow, these are better than what I came up with.
I thought of that too, like Talamantes, like they were running away for something bad they did.
Of course, this is also telling me a lot about each of you. So, yeah, your answers are very interesting. Yeah.
Abraham wanted to say something.
Regarding the secret, yes, I also thought it was about some kind of dirty secret about the marriage. But well, we discussed that last night.
No, they're happy. They're a loving couple, you know, like they're just, it's this terrible thing. I mean, you're talking about terrible things I do to my characters, right? I mean, that poor woman, she doesn't deserve that. You know, it's just a bad thing that happens.
Very good. We're gonna close this lovely conversation with a question from Talamantes.
Yes, one last question, Professor. You say that when you're writing like a novel, a first novel, a second novel, you have to go nuts about the story, about the writing. What would your advice be for someone who likes to write short stories of horror, fantasy, etc.? Do we have to go nuts too in these kind of stories?
I think you have to do what you want to do. I think that you should follow what you want to do, and I think that when you're writing, it's hard not to think about the market. Where am I going to place this? Is you know, I mean, of course you think about those things, but I think as much as possible, what you have to focus on is telling the story that you want to tell, and not censoring yourself, not thinking to yourself, people aren't going to like this, or this has been done before, or any of those other things that sabotage us. Um, because we're very good, I think, human beings at sabotaging what we want to do. And so I think that it is a sort of an act of faith. You do have to trust your imagination, and you do have to trust that the combination of your imagination and the work that you put into what you're doing will yield a good result. And you know, of course, there will be revision, there will be editing, of course, but that's part of the whole process. And I think you know, the writer, I was driving to a convention, I think about 2 years ago, and I was listening to an interview with the writer George Saunders, and he said something to the effect of, in the time you have left, be bold. And I liked that idea. I like that idea. You know, I'm 51. I hope, of course, I'm only, you know, halfway done, but it may not be. And so in the time I have left, I want to be bold. And I think that that's good advice for all of us. You know, be bold, be daring. It there's nothing to lose. I think, and I think that I think that kind of courage is always in short supply in everything, not just in art. But I think that that in an odd way, to the extent that each of us can contribute that kind of courage through the art that we make, I think we help to make things better in some weird metaphysical way that I can't quite articulate as well as I would like to. So I would say write the story you want to write, then and then worry about the other stuff later on. You know, when you get done with that story, when you send it out, then start writing the next story, and keep working to get to what you want.
Well, Abraham wants to close this conversation. Abraham wants to have the last French fried.
I promise. Professor, we started this chat talking about your coming to the fantasy writing through comic books. So given the chance that you will develop a graphic novel or a limited series of comic books, do you have any project in your imagination that you would like to develop strictly for this media, or would you like to develop these branches, very interesting, about the Dark City, the Black Sea? What will be your choice given the chance to do whatever you want in a comic book?
I would love to work in comics. Paul Tremblay and I have an idea for a limited series that we would like to do. At one point we were, I don't know how close we really were, but we were close enough anyway. It was enough of a possibility, and so I'm hopeful that we might get around to that. This would be like maybe 4 to 6 issues of something. Um, I think it would be great fun to write, and that would be an original series. I think it would be great fun to write something else, you know, another original series. I think it would be great fun to mess around with a character like John Constantine in the DC universe. The Hellblazer comic was one of the few comics I think I really faithfully followed almost every issue of, and I really felt that um, it brought out the best in most of its writers. There was something about that character that people just really rose to the occasion, and it would be fun to take a crack at him. So and now, you know, there's so much good stuff still that's being done, and so much good horror and horror related stuff that's being done. I have a hard time keeping up with, and I don't keep up with all of it because in part because I can't afford it. It's comics are, you know, I remember when comics were 20 cents, you know, and that is not the case anymore. But I think that there's just amazing and dynamic work that's being done in comics right now, which makes me very happy. It really does. I miss, I think what I miss in a way in the big two, in Marvel and DC, is the sense that you had in the 1970s that they were just trying everything. They were willing to just, let's just try anything and let's let it go for a couple of years even, and just sort of see how it does. Nowadays, it's part of, I feel, that same conservatism that you see in film, where it's, you know, well, Batman sells, so we'll do 10 Batman comics, and maybe we don't need 10 Batman comics. Maybe we need something else. So I would like to see, among those big comic book companies, I would like to see a bit more diversity in what they're doing. But certainly, as in publishing, you know, a lot of smaller presses have really picked up the burden, and are really doing astonishing stuff.
Well, so I guess this has been a very diverse too conversation. We talk about many. I mean, everything is it goes all the way to literature, but it always goes to horror. We mentioned Lovecraft too. I mean, it's been great, Professor. We would like, I just want to tell you that there's a lot of people who were watching this conversation, as I said, from Chile, from Guatemala, from Latin America, from different states in Mexico, from Puebla, from Aguascalientes, and the people here in the chat room. Most of us are from Monterrey. The rest is from Mexico City. Ernesto, Caro is from here. Al, I don't know where are you from, Al, but you guys are right now in San Francisco, right? That's why you can see there's still some sunny.
Some daylight, yeah. I did wonder about that. I did, yeah. But
they are in Cali.
Whereas Gabby is completely in darkness, and I'm worried about her. Something's going to come out of the darkness behind her, you know.
So what I'm gonna do is this: I'm gonna cut the Facebook live transmission. So you want to tell any last things before I cut them, and we're gonna stay a few minutes here just to say
sure. Okay.
Goodbye.
So the three books that since we said so Peter Straub's novel Ghost Story. It's a classic. It was a book that I used to take out of my library when I was a child, and I would read it, and I got to the end of it, and I thought, I'm not sure what happened, but that was great. You know, I didn't feel angry or resentful. I was so excited to think I would go back and reread this and find more stuff the next time around. So, and I was at a convention a few years ago on a panel about Peter's work, and all the writers there, everybody kept saying, ghost story, ghost story, ghost story. So I think that's absolutely one that's is a central book for me. Let's add two recent books. Sylvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic. That is a book that just goes nuts. That is a book that starts off and you think, at least I thought, oh, all right, I see I did not see what she was doing. It just goes in this utterly lunatic and wonderful direction. So if you have a chance to read that, I would absolutely recommend it. And maybe a collection of stories by Livia Llewellyn, who's I feel a writer who's lesser known than she should be. She's written two stories, two collections of stories, excuse me, Engines of Desire and Furnace. And I think either of those, I think I like Furnace a little bit better maybe, but I think that both the collections of stories are absolutely worth reading. So something that's a little bit older and a couple of things that are a little bit newer.
Thank you very much, Professor. So I wanted to say thanks to the people on Facebook live transmission. Thanks for joining us this first time we are doing our reunion in English. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you have any extra doubts, please don't hesitate in sending questions or comments. Maybe later we can pass it to Professor Langan, so he might respond to questions you might have. But for tonight, we're gonna say bye-bye to the people in Facebook Live and see you soon.
See you, Facebook.